I hope what people are hearing is that we don't need to, I think sometimes we aren't sharing stories in digital places because we overthink it, we overcomplicate it. It can be more simple and more impactful than we realize. I hope some of the very practical things I shared would inspire people to say, okay, I could do that. I can write an email this week and ask people 3 questions and ask them for a photo. Everyone can do that. So I hope people hear that it can be done. And I hope also people hear that we have a responsibility to steward and tell stories, to tell stories of God's work, declare his work one generation to the next, tell of his mighty deeds, that there is good news to share. And there is lots of doom and gloom in the world, doom and gloom in the church, that people love to focus on bad news. We all know that the algorithm loves to feed us more bad news because we react to it, but there is a lot of good news to share and to hear. And I think we need to encourage one another, to spur one another on through these encouraging stories.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Sowers Podcast. My name is Matt Naismith, and I am your host. On this podcast, we share stories from church planters and leaders who are influencing kingdom movement and impacting their communities. Whether you're a church planter, a pastor in a church, part of a church planting team, or just curious to learn more, our hope is that these conversations inspire you to be a sower in the places where you live, work, learn, and play. If this podcast blesses you, we'd love for you to share episodes and subscribe on your preferred platform. Now, let's dive into our next conversation. Welcome, friends, to the Sowers Podcast. Thanks for joining us for this episode and this conversation. I hope you're enjoying your day thus far and that this podcast will be an encouragement to you and an equipping opportunity for you to grow as a sower of the gospel in the places where you live, work, learn, and play. If you're new to the podcast, a very special welcome to you. Why don't you go ahead and follow us on X, on Instagram. It's at /the Sowers Pod. You can also follow us along at YouTube, Spotify, Apple Music. Hit subscribe, follow along so that you can be updated when new episodes are released. Well, today I'm excited for you to hear a conversation that I had with Joanna la Fleur. Joanna is a speaker, podcaster, and digital communications expert with over 20 years of experience helping churches share the gospel. As executive director of Word Made Digital, she develops digital strategies for churches and nonprofits. She also serves as marketing and communications director at Alpha Canada, where over 100,000 Canadians explore faith each year, and she advises organizations like Wycliffe College and Tyndale University. Joanna lives in Toronto with Pearl the pug. She loves coffee, and she's traveled to over 41 countries. In this conversation, Joanna shares her faith journey and the transformative role of digital media in church communication. She highlights the importance of storytelling in engaging communities, showing how personal narratives and modern tools can make the gospel accessible and impactful. Well, friends, without further ado, here is my conversation with Joanna la Fleur. Well, Joanna, a very special welcome to the Sowers Podcast.
Thank you. Glad to be here with you today.
I would love for you, something that I ask a number of my guests when we first jump on is, I think there's such power in being reminded of how we came to know Jesus ourselves. Would you mind sharing with us a little bit of your own story of coming to Christ and how the gospel was sown into your life?
Yeah. In its most brief, I come from a family of real Christian type folks for many generations. My dad is Dutch, accent and all, and came to Canada. His grandfather would have been a preacher in the Netherlands, and his father was the one if anyone from a Dutch background is listening, my grandfather was the one in politics who made Christian education one of the free options in the Netherlands. So in Canada, we could do Catholic or French or public schools. In the Netherlands, you can also do Christian schools. So my grandfather did that. So just on that side, on my mom's side, my mom's family were the founders of what's called the People's Church in Toronto, which in its day was one of the first mega churches, but it was particularly focused on global missions and
Yeah.
fundraising for global missions. And so my mom grew up in that context with her family in that church. So what I mean by that is by the time I came along, decades after their upbringing, it was very much in them and it was lived out in front of me. My family had the opportunity with my dad's engineering work to live in a few other countries. And the reason to go was engineering, but the heart behind it was missions and ministry and serving in these often quite poor places. Place like Romania, for example, in the 90s, right after Ceausescu, the dictator, fell, and I'm being a kid grappling with going into HIV/AIDS orphanages with children rocking back and forth because no one picked up the child today to just cuddle them, and thinking about a church where at the time we would have said the gypsy people, but I think Roma is probably the way they would be referred to today. Roma people were invited to the church, and everyone thought in the town that this was like a cult because they were letting this other racial and ethnic group join them, and they weren't trustworthy people in the community. So I just say I had some pretty radical experiences coming from a heritage of faith where it was just simply practiced, not perfectly, but practiced in front of me. It was refugees at the dinner table kinds of household. And so it was natural to, from as early as I could remember, to love Jesus and to follow him. That doesn't mean I didn't have lots of questions and wonderings along the way. I still do. Oh my goodness. There's complex world and the answers are not always clear or easy. And sometimes there are no answers. The answer is there's no real clarity of answer. And we can be okay with that in our faith too. That's why it's faith, not for sure. But yeah, I think in that sense, I'm grateful for a heritage of faith. And into my adult years, it more and more became mine, not my family's, my own decisions and choices to have an integrity of what I say and what I do with my money, my time, my mind, my body, aligning more and more, which is never perfect, but sort of the journey I've been on. It's a bit of a roundabout way of answering, but as long as I can remember, I have known Jesus and loved Jesus and talked to Jesus, talked with Jesus and heard from him since as early as I can remember. But my own faithfulness to him has come and gone a little bit.
As it does for many of us. I'm wondering if you could give us a brief overview to how your passion for digital communication, media began to overlap in your pursuit of Christ.
Yeah. Well, again, like in high school, I was part of a youth group where there were like 300 students in this youth group, which felt like a high school of its own. Because there were so many of us. And I became some sort of volunteer communications director there. I talked at school, I was doing the announcements and I liked media. And it was in an age where like those colored Apple computers were the thing everybody wanted, and video software and technology and digital cameras and all that stuff was starting to be more affordable and accessible to an average person. But coming from an engineering background with my dad, arts and creative wasn't like a valid career path. I went into a business program, and I shouldn't say not valid, but it just wasn't considered like you do something practical. And so I came out of school with a focus from business and marketing. I was in the era, like I lived in this town where the BlackBerry was invented, Waterloo, Ontario at the time, and studied there. And it was the tool the world used at that time before. And then the iPhone came out just sort of as I was finishing my university years. And, just to age me, if everyone's trying to figure out my age. And so as this millennial bridging between, the millennial generation being the last to remember analog and the first to fully embrace digital, it was a natural part of my whole life, but I was also timing my own milestones of life development right along with some key tech, like graduating and an iPhone came out. So I worked in tech in my first few years, and what I call the big black box story happened. The tech we sold at this company, doesn't really matter what it does, but what it looked like was ultimately like a big black metal box, like a CPU and companies would buy stacks of these to read stuff on their networks. And I was in marketing and PR for them. And the graphic designer pulls me over to his desk one day, and he's got this main product on the screen, trying different effects in Photoshop. Hey, Joanna, do you like this or this? How about this? And he's trying different stuff. He says, Joanna, what can I do to make this look sexy? I'm like, man, there's nothing you can do to make this look sexy. Like, it's just a big black box. And I felt like in that moment, I can picture it, in that cubicle, this is like classic tech company. There's like foosball and beer on tap and like people playing in the background. And I'm standing at this desk, and I felt like the Lord spoke very clearly to me in that moment, in a way I have only heard that clearly a few times. And it was like, what are you doing, Joanna? Like, you don't care about the big black box. You know you're supposed to use these skills to serve the church. These same skills you're using here in marketing, communications, PR, whatever, you're supposed to use it for the church. What are you doing? Anyways, very soon after that, I didn't know what to do with it in the moment, but very soon after that, it was like God prompting me, and doors began opening, and I began wading from tech world into church land and worked in churches for many years, before I do what I'm doing today. But that's where like media, church, creative, it all kind of crashed together. And it has really in many ways been a sense of calling in my life to figure out how, what I often say, churches have not just the good news, but we have the best news in the world. But often churches are terrible communicators. We make good news sound like bad news.
Right.
Whether that's because we're just like grumpy and angry, or we're out of date and old school and irrelevant in how we talk about things. But so my work in life overall is, how can we help church make good news sound like good news? And that includes using modern tech, media, digital tech, whatever is available to us, the tools of our day. How do we use them to communicate as best as we can? Because we have the most important thing to say.
Thinking of some of your earliest experiences working in a church, I'm wondering if you could talk about the evolution from where tech was at that point to now, as you're helping churches think through this, have the podcast on TV. Like how has the tech evolved?
Well, one thing is, like, I remember opening Facebook accounts, Twitter accounts, Instagram accounts, like they didn't exist, and we were making them for the churches. And it was like a thing off the side of your desk, where now one major shift that I think it's helpful for churches to understand, especially leaders who don't work in this day to day, things like social media, it has become a full-time job. It's not a thing you just do off the side of your desk. If you're going to do it in a way that's effective,
right,
and you're feeling like, why aren't we seeing results? It isn't really something you can spend 10 minutes a day to do. If like there are people who their only job is Instagram, like that is their job. And that wasn't the case even just 10 and 15 years ago. I think another piece of it is, at the same time, tech has really allowed accessibility and affordability for churches. The phones that most of us carry in our pocket has a far better camera than these $10,000 cameras 10 years ago. These $10,000 camera setups we would have been using, and lenses and tripods and all this stuff, like even $15,000 or $20,000 setups, like huge amounts of money to do what our phone in our pocket can achieve now, just as well, or almost as well. And in some cases better than those old cameras. Things like, I was just meeting with a church today, and they were saying, like, classic church scenario, hey, we need a logo graphic for this new Bible study series, and we need it by tomorrow, printed on a poster. And the woman's like, oh my goodness, like 2 years ago, that wouldn't have been possible. And she goes into Canva, which is free for churches as a social media and graphic design tool that, again, 10 years ago was a junk tool, now is quite good and free for churches. And she goes in and types a description of what she needs. And the first graphic that it designed with AI she's like, oh, this is really good. And then she gets it to the printer and sends it out. And like suddenly, like, something that would have taken money and a professional designer, not all things can be done by AI. Like, we still need graphic designers, but something like that has become quick, more affordable, more accessible, designed for dummies. We still do need the designers and the videographers and all this stuff, but now there is a lot that can be done to speed up that process or make it more accessible for church leaders. So in that sense, I think then the other side of that is now we all feel this pressure to do something. Oh, we have this. What do we do with it? How do we steward these resources? And like, I don't know anything about AI. How am I supposed to know what to do with it now? So it can be overwhelming in the other way. Now we have access to it, but we maybe don't have education.
Mm-hmm. It seems to me like, and I don't know the exact timestamps on it, but I'd be interested to know your perspective that, 10 to 15 years ago, people were, at least millennials, were kind of jumping into Facebook and then Instagram came out. And then maybe like 5 to 7 years ago, there was this kind of rejection of it. And now it seems like people are kind of coming back again around to it. Have you seen that? And why do you think where people are recognizing that it's so essential to have some sort of engagement, some sort of focus in these arenas?
Yeah, it's, I think it's, Andy Stanley would say, it's not a problem to solve, it's a tension to manage. It is a tension. I mean, we're seeing laws come out in, I think Australia just announced most recently that they're trying to have a ban for under 16-year-olds on social media as a government. And then reading the fine print on that, it's almost impossible to actually enforce.
Yeah.
So like they're trying to do something, but like what can you do?
Yeah.
So in that sense, there's a recognition that there is concern. There is stuff to do, particularly with mental health and addiction and self-esteem. And that is like really affecting all of us, not just young people. And so how do we have like a healthy relationship with it? But maybe if I could compare it this way, I don't know where it sits on the spectrum. People might disagree with me. But so if you have a problem with alcohol, the solution would be do not drink alcohol at all. Period. But if you have trouble with overeating, if you have a food addiction, the solution isn't don't eat.
Right.
We need to eat to sustain our lives. And so I think now maybe an honest way of looking at it is like these kinds of digital platforms, or even just having a smartphone at all, is kind of more in the food category than the alcohol category. Like we do need it in our society to function. Like there's restaurants you go to, you can't even look at the menu without, maybe, I don't know, maybe they have paper menus if you ask, but that point being like you need it so ubiquitously. It's closer to the food addiction category than the alcohol, because I don't know how you could cut it out of your life completely, but we do need a better relationship with it.
Mm-hmm.
And I do think churches have an opportunity, maybe even a responsibility, to help disciple our people in every category of life. And if this is a big one right now culturally, then this would be one of how do we grapple with it? And where as a church are we hurting and helping people, like forcing people to go online to do things to interact with our church versus, in person, how are we managing that? It is complicated. It's a tension.
What is the power of storytelling? Because I think that's probably a key motivating force to being engaged online. Telling your story. So why is storytelling so powerful, and how can churches begin to do that effectively?
Yeah, well, I think a lot of churches aren't doing storytelling, and that's why their social media sucks. They're just using it as a bulletin board where you post an announcement and run away. But if used well, the things that resonate with people are stories. And stories, I'm not an anthropologist, but story is one of our most ancient art forms. It's one of our most ancient ways of connecting with each other, of passing values and traditions, meaning from one generation to the next. Has always been. Humans are storytellers. Animals don't tell stories. Humans tell stories. Humans want to hear and know stories. It's how we find meaning and understanding. And I think an emotional, we love to think we're all logical, but a story is in many ways emotion and surprise and delight and grief and all the things that a story can be. And it's what we remember far more than the left brain logic side of things. So storytelling, I think, is has always been, but in an age where we have these affordable, accessible tools, what an opportunity to tell stories, to tell our stories, to tell the stories of our congregations, to tell the greatest story, the story of God's great love for the world. And I think we also have, maybe I would say, to go further, one thing I often say is we have a responsibility to steward the stories in our own church communities. If God has done something in a person's life or a family or something in our church, there's no other church that can tell the story. It is our own church's responsibility to share that story. It's ours to steward. And so we should tell those stories. There's lots of ways we can do that. I don't know if you want to get into the weeds of it, but I do think it's almost like a responsibility. And then maybe the other piece of it, I'll say lastly, just as a philosophy, is in an age of like post-truth, this idea of like, that's your truth, this is my truth. We see trends, certainly with younger generations, where story is valid. I may not agree with your belief system.
Right.
But if a Christian shares a story of what God has done in their life, why they believe in Jesus, or what happened in some moment in their day, like Jesus answered a prayer or something, generally, like, those are received. It's like, I may not agree, I may not believe what you believe, but like, I receive your truth, like that's your truth or whatever. That idea of like story sharing does seem to be an access point into people's hearts and minds, and a way to connect with a generation around faith, or at least help them consider it.
Friends, we will get back to my interview with Joanna in just a moment. Prior to that, however, I want to let you know about Word Made Digital. Word Made Digital's goal is to help 1 million Christians and 10,000 churches navigate the Great Commission in the digital age. Inspired by John 1, where the Word became flesh, Word Made Digital was founded in 2016 to help embody the gospel in the digital age. The focus of their work and research is on evangelism and discipleship in the 21st century. As we navigate the largest communications shift since the rise of the printing press, Christian leaders need practical tools and creative strategies that are grounded in a healthy theology and a love for people. You want to reach and teach this generation with the best news in the world, and if that's you, they are here to help. Joanna la Fleur, the founder, says the church has the best news in the world, so we should be the best communicators in the world. If you want to learn more about Word Made Digital, you can visit wordmadedigital.com. Once again, that is wordmadedigital.com. It might be helpful to get into the weeds a little bit. I'm just thinking about our listener who's like, okay, Joanna, it's important to get involved online, but then they're like, what in the world is my next step? And we could probably take an hour just to walk through steps. But could you maybe then share with us just a story of a church or a Christian ministry using story effectively on social media and the impact that it had?
Yeah, I'm going to go like real basic. Somebody who has a story. You email them 3 or 4 questions of like, the who, what, where, when, why, how, about like, it depends on the nature of the story, but if it's a testimony of Jesus, is like, what was your life like before? How did you meet Jesus? What is your life like now? 3 questions. Get them to write you back in an email an answer to that. Ask them to send a photo of themselves or their family or whatever the context of that story is. Then you copy and paste. I mean, maybe you need to edit it for spelling or brevity. Take the photo, upload it to your page with the copy paste of their story in their own words below. Question, answer, question, answer. There, you've just done it. You could do that every single week, 52 stories in 52 weeks of the year. And you could blitz and get all those stories over. You don't have to be doing that actively every week. You could be once a month going and saying, there's people I want, hey, that story, could I email you and get you to help me write that down? It might take them a little bit to get back to you. They might need a reminder, but like eventually you'll get it back. And and not every story has to be as perfectly tied up in a bow like that. Like I just suggested the before, how you met Jesus story. It might just be like I've never volunteered before. I decided it was time. I'm now volunteering and I don't hate it. Like, it doesn't have to be that complicated, but that's a story too. Like, well, praise God that they want to serve, or, whatever it may be. There's these, not every story has to have a happy ending yet. They could be stories in the middle, but like, that's low tech, low capacity for a leader to steward and get stories. Another level up from that I've loved in a church where I've seen, if you have access, or even a basic iPhone these days can probably do it. But if you have maybe like a bit of a nicer camera gear, or someone in your congregation does, or you rent it, or whatever it may be, I've seen this with baptisms, for example, if they want to do like baptism stories, but it could be for any kind of story. Again, get the person to write their story on one piece of paper, like one page. And you can help edit it to clean it up, tighten it up, or clarify if it's a little bit wonky. And then you get them to record their voice reading the story into a microphone. And that microphone can be a microphone attached to an iPhone that costs you $30 on Amazon. Like, doesn't matter. Just like you can go higher tech than that. Probably most churches have nice mics because they're churches, but get them to record the story, just read the story. And then you put your camera in slow motion. iPhones have this function. And I don't know what the story is. If it's a story about God working in their family or whatever, you can literally have them in slow motion walking down a beautiful path in the park near their house. And then you put some music and everything feels more emotive when it's in slow motion. You get them walking down the road, you get their voiceover that's a minute or less, you put it all together, and now you've got a story video. It's so basic and so simple. And I've seen a church who did that, like rinse and repeat over and over and over. And it was just like, I don't know, they're like pushing their kid on a swing in the park, or they're like slow motion washing the dishes in their kitchen or something. Like, you don't need much footage if it's in slow motion because it fills up a lot of time.
Yeah.
And you just get a few clips of them doing something in slow motion. You put their own voice reading their thing behind, get a nice song behind that suits the tone of the story. Great. You got a story for Sunday. You got a story for Easter. You got a story for social media. Again, these are like very, very like detailed practice. I could go even, we could go even further into it, but people can reach out to me if they have more questions about how to pull that off. But I'm just trying to illustrate that it doesn't have to be complicated.
Right.
We can use very simple tools, and we don't need to compete with $1 million budget ad campaigns. We can use the tools we have to tell the stories. And of course, like, that's a story then that the church can use. They could use it this year, and then 2 years from now, that story might be relevant to a sermon series. So they use it again. The story isn't old, or, it can be shared around to family and friends. It can be like, hey, this story feels like a story of someone hit forward, share it with them. It might impact them. So all to say, a story like that can be used more than once. It has a long shelf life. It can go far. It can be used in means of encouragement, evangelism, etc. It kind of depends on the story, but they don't have to be that hard to pull off.
Right. How important would you say, like, the branding or the look is? Or would you say, listen, something of story is, using the examples that you did, like, just having those there is better than nothing. Like, where is the tension in that relationship? Because you'll see like churches with large budgets that are able to pull off, wow, every post, like, it could be one of these things you're talking about, but that it also has the background that's their church's chosen social media colors. And so someone goes, oh, I can't do that, so therefore I'm not going to do anything at all.
Yeah. Well, maybe on one level, I'll just say doing it and making it look really good is easier than ever and cheaper than ever. So at one level, I'll just, if you need your logo, it's free on like a lot of software. You can go on Canva, which is free for churches, upload a video, and you can drag in your logo. You can put music behind, you can do it all there. It'll take you step by step through. There's AI tools that might edit a lot of it for you, etc. But so it is easier to pull off than ever. But more than that, I think we all know, if we've been on social media, you could spend all this time curating these posts that you love and you think is really going to resonate with people. And it's like crickets, like very little resonance. And then you post like something where it's like you talking into your camera while you're making a cup of coffee, and it like hits with people and it goes off, and like everybody connected to it. Everybody being your church community, or, whoever everybody is in your case. So we see that in things like TikTok. Like there's a lot of people who've become wealthy and famous filming just with their phone, telling stories about their days or whatever into their phone, like into basic phone camera software. So it seems the story matters more than the tech. The tech is getting better and cheaper and more accessible, easier to use by people like me who don't have video editing background. The quality seems to matter not so much. So maybe I would say in general, like we're not trying to make it look bad. So if you can make it look better, make it look better. Yeah. But maybe the other piece I'll say to this is thinking about what I would say is, I often talk about the Honda versus the Mercedes. And what I mean is, or even the bicycle, what kind of vehicle do we need to get us where we're going today? Right. There are times where it's prom, it's a wedding, you want like a 1950s car, you want a limo, you want some gorgeous, expensive luxury experience, i.e. you want to pay a few $1,000s or more to have like a stunning video, and you've hired out to make it happen, and there's multiple cameras and all the stuff, and like there's reasons why you might choose that vehicle. I think day to day most of us are very happy getting around in our Honda Civic or Toyota Corolla or whatever you drive, your minivan, and it's totally not just adequate, it's great. Like it's reliable, it does the job, it gets you everywhere you need to go. And then sometimes that's not even what you need. Like you just need a bicycle to get around. I live in a city, so I bike, I have an e-scooter, I have a car too, but there's lots of ways to get around. And I think sometimes we're measuring against that Mercedes limo special occasion video, when like most stuff we just need like our regular old Honda Civic. But we need like the basic thing is enough. And so there are probably a few videos a year that you might want to put a budget together to hire like professionals, certain stories, or maybe it's for Christmas or a special event, or just like a story that is very special that you want to do and tell well. You could hire in for that. But most stuff we do, don't overthink it. Just like, what's the tools we have? What can we afford to do? We just are trying to get from A to B. Not everything needs to be this high level experience.
When you think about your experience working with churches or individuals on this, can you share with us a couple of what you would say are success stories of people engaging and someone on the other end being a recipient of the greatest news and it changing their life?
Man, yeah, now I'm pulling out of so many years of this work. I mean, there are definitely, I can think of stories in the church I worked at where someone shared a video of their own story with someone in their family who had never been willing to come to church. And then they just said, hey, like, I know you don't want to come, but like, here's my baptism story video or whatever. And that was the thing that broke through to that dad to get him to like, I didn't know that's what it was. I didn't know that was your story. Oh, I didn't, like in the privacy of his own home or in his own car with his phone or wherever he watched that, it gave him a moment to actually hear the story in a way that he hadn't been willing before from his daughter. I'm thinking about that story. So sometimes a story on video, for example, or it doesn't have to be video, but it might break through because they can process it. They could watch it again. They can rewind it.
Right.
They could maybe like watch it privately without having to perform their reaction. And they might actually then therefore have an honest reaction to the story rather than perform for their kid. I'm thinking about, I'm thinking about a baptism story that then when the dad a year later is getting baptized, this is part of the story, is the baptism video from the daughter. And like he had never wanted to come. And then finally he was able to receive right thing, right time, God's timing. There's so much and so many. I think anytime we can share a story or it's like, oh, that's like me. I think of stories at Alpha, for example, where I work and have privilege of hearing so many stories of life change, where it's a story like them, whether it's a refugee story, it's a rural youth story, like it's someone from a small town, it's a story of an elderly whatever it may be, whether it's your demographic, your ethnicity, these stories where like there was a story of a Persian guy who came to faith, who was a realtor, he came to faith on Alpha, and then that story was used to invite other Persian people to come check out Alpha, and then they were willing to do it because they heard a story from someone from their own kind of cultural background. Right. So yeah, of course, there's so many. I'm like trying. It's always classically like off the top of it. But the point is, when people can find themselves in the story or have a chance to process it in a different way, I see the impact of that. It doesn't have to be, again, it doesn't even have to be video. It could just be in writing or other ways that people are telling stories.
You mentioned Alpha there, and I think that's a great transition.
Yeah.
I think Alpha is, can we say it stood the test of time? It's at least probably been the last 25 years, but a 25-year run with an evangelistic curriculum is pretty strong, I would say. Yeah. What, as you're now working with Alpha, speak to it as kind of a case study of storytelling, of digital engagement, of now as you give leadership to the brand of Alpha Canada, like helping in all of that. Share with us it kind of as a case study to encourage those that are listening about the power of story and the power of digital engagement.
Yeah. Well, I'm a little reluctant to use Alpha as an example to encourage a local church because the resources we would have are global and a local church has local resources. So what I mean by that is every story we tell at Alpha is about a local church's work and impact in somebody's life. But in that sense, like if Alpha, the organization, is coming in to help tell the story, it's probably at a bit of a different level than local. Now, that said, as part of my work, I think is trying to change that. Because as I've said, I think even if I could say, we've talked about this at Alpha Canada, that like, where have we done a disservice to the church by making every story have to be a Mercedes level story before we tell it? Where like, actually, like there's lots of stories that are really like a story like, I have never invited someone to Alpha. I have always been really shy about sharing my faith. I don't want to impose it on anyone. But you know what? I think my friend at work might actually really enjoy this and they need this. I'm going to ask them if they want to come to Alpha with me. And I asked them. I'd never done that before. I asked them, and you know what? They said they weren't available on Tuesday nights, but we're still friends and they're going to come to the barbecue at my place next weekend.
Yeah.
Like that's not a Mercedes story. What I mean by that is like, I invited my coworker and they became a Christian and then their whole family became Christians and now they run a church, like, which are stories we hear at Alpha. But I think then sometimes we neglect to tell those small and simple stories, like those common faithful stories of a person who had the courage to invite. And yeah, sure, they said no this time, but like, what if you ask them next time? They might say yes. Or even just you learned that you asked this person and they said no, thank you, but you're still cool. Like it's still good between you. It didn't go weird. That'll give you courage to invite another person. And that story might give someone else hearing it the courage to invite their coworker and know that it's not about the perfect, happy outcome. It's about the faithfulness and the courage to even try. And so I think sometimes maybe I'll say that the bigger Alpha thing can come in and say that only a certain kind of story matters. But actually, I think all those stories are like important and impactful. So maybe that's a bit of, an indirect way of kind of coming at some of what you're talking about. But at Alpha, we're hearing stories of what God is doing across the world, but particularly in Canada, it seems to be a really remarkable moment, if I could speak to that, Matt, because we have the privilege at Alpha of hearing from, working with, serving churches, like so many denominations, so many, like from urban to rural, from like church plant to 250-year-old church, and Catholic, Protestant, Pentecostal, Baptist, a Chinese church, a Caribbean church, whatever. All of these kinds of churches, and hearing like this pattern we're seeing over and over in the story of like This is like a unique moment in Canada. I don't know if others you've been speaking to on the podcast have been speaking about this, but we're seeing something unusual that we haven't seen in more than a decade, if not more. And even like we did at Alpha, we did like a huge research survey earlier in 2024 that came out in this something like May, June of 24, alphacanada.org/reigniting hope. So reigniting hope, sharing the good news in Canada. And the point being, it was a follow-up to a survey we'd done a few years ago, researched like hundreds, thousand pastors, leaders trying to get their context. And there is something where like people are more open to faith and discussions about Jesus than we've seen in a long time. There is like an openness and a hunger and a curiosity across the country that we're hearing from all kinds of churches. We're also seeing that in the churches and the leadership of churches that there is a desire, a longing, an interest for whether we call it evangelism or just faith sharing or, good news, talking about Jesus. There seems to be even like an increase in the temperature of that, where even leaders themselves are reporting higher levels of having these conversations in their own personal life. We're seeing movements in churches to organize around these activities, movements of prayer. Like I just was at a prayer meeting where they were expecting a bunch of churches in Toronto, different denominations and groups gathered together. And I live in the downtown of Toronto. Matt, I've never seen this before. I went because partly I went as a church participant, part of my congregation, but I also went, also wearing my Alpha staff hat. We were expecting about 150 or 200 people. 1,000 people showed up on a Thursday night to pray. 1,000 people. Like this, I've never seen before in Toronto. I know other cities have seen it, but in my city, I haven't seen that in my adult life. There is something that maybe Alpha is taking notice of because we can see that pattern tracked across all kinds of types of churches. What God is doing across the country. There's churches that they're expecting 100 people to come to Alpha and 300 are coming. Like the problem is they don't have enough volunteers or food. Like that's a good problem. Like so many people are coming to explore faith. They don't have, or like they need to start a whole new table with a new language group. I mean, again, in a Toronto area context that I'm thinking of, because that's where I live, there's so many like new immigrants who would prefer to do Alpha in their own languages. So, I mean, the stories go on, but there is something stirring. And I know, your listeners and Matt, you and I don't know each other too well, but this isn't how I normally talk. It is a new thing or, a hashtag watch this space. Like what are you up to?
Yeah.
And how do we get to be, how can we be part of it? Or like, what is our piece of this? And so then at Alpha, my little piece of that in the Alpha story is like, how do I help tell these stories? How do we find even just like, where are these young creatives across the country who might want to pull out their iPhones and capture the stories of what God's doing when 300 people show up when they expected 100 at their Alpha, or like when they're running a whole table that's in, an Arabic language group at the table, not that we have to be careful. We're not trying to violate privacy. So of course we would never want to show videos without people's permission if they don't want to be included in the stories. But there's an opportunity, I think, to kind of like catch up to what God is doing and try and tell those stories online and, everywhere else.
Well, it just reminds me of Jesus' words, and it's a theme and a scripture that comes up regularly on this podcast is when Jesus says, the harvest is plentiful, but the laborers are few. Yeah. Or as I heard someone else put it, he said, there's more interested people in hearing about Jesus than there are interested Christians to tell them. And certainly what you're talking about here illustrates that point. As we close, Joanna, could you share with us what you've already shared with us around, there's a hopefulness there, but what would you want to be as your closing words to those that would be listening about sowing of the gospel in the digital realm, and then given what you've determined and what Alpha has discovered through these statistics?
Yeah. I hope what people are hearing is that we don't need to, I think sometimes we aren't sharing stories in digital places because we overthink it, we overcomplicate it. It can be more simple and more more impactful than we realize. I hope some of the very practical things I shared would inspire people to say, okay, I could do that. I can write an email this week and ask people 3 questions and ask them for a photo.
Yeah.
Everyone can do that. So I hope people hear that it can be done. And I hope also people hear that we have a responsibility to steward and tell stories, to tell the stories of God's work, declare his work one generation to the next, tell of his mighty deeds, that there is good news to share. And there is lots of doom and gloom in the world, doom and gloom in the church, that people love to focus on bad news. We all know that the algorithm loves to feed us more bad news because we react to it. But there is a lot of good news to share and to hear. And I think we need to encourage one another, to spur one another on through these encouraging stories, even if they're small and simple. I invited someone and we're still friends, even though they said they didn't want to come to church. Amazing. Praise God that you had the courage to try and you're still friends. Because it is that simple. I think Carrie Nieuwhof just posted a stat, something like 75% of people would come to church if you asked, but only 2% of Christians ever ask.
Yeah.
So the harvest is plentiful. There are other countries in the world are puzzled by us because we don't share our faith. They're puzzled because we seem to be often worried about political correctness or offense. We're not trying to offend on purpose by any means, but sort of out of a fear of offense, we say nothing. But I think if we can share stories, maybe that's a Canadian way to be softer about how we share good news. Would you share some stories? And that there are people who aren't interested, but there are actually more people that are interested than aren't interested. People are looking for truth. People are looking for hope. People are looking for something long lasting in a time of, quick fixes. And I hope that people feel encouraged to do that in person, online. It doesn't even have to be your story. Just share somebody else's. But yeah, there are stories to tell, and it's our great privilege to be part of it.
Joanna, thank you for being part of the Sowers podcast.
Thanks, Matt.
Well, friends, I'm sure you'd agree that there is so much from my conversation with Joanna that could be applied as this episode's action step. The thing that I want to focus on, however, is story. As Joanna said, story is such a huge part of our culture. It's such a huge way in which we can exhibit to other people what's going on in our lives. And as Joanna said, in this kind of post-truth world or culture that we seem to find ourselves in, the power of story is pretty significant because you're simply expressing what's going on in your life based upon your own experience. And so I want to invite you to share a part of your story. Maybe you can do that through the digital format, or you can do that over a coffee or by inviting somebody over that does not know and love Jesus. Invite them to share their story and then take the opportunity to share with them a bit about your own story and how God has been working and moving in your life lately. This is the invitation, this is the call, and this is the action step. Now, after you do this, I would love to hear from you. And so please go ahead and engage with us on social media. If you don't have social media, you can email ask@thesowerspod.ca. I would love to then share the stories of you as a listener and how this podcast is helping you and is equipping you to become a sower in the places where you live, work, learn, and play. So share the story and then share your own story and then share the story back with us, as we'd love to share that more broadly as well. Well, friends, as always, if this episode was an encouragement to you, if there's someone on your mind right now that you think that you should share it with, why don't you go ahead and do that right away so that you don't forget. And now, friends, I'm going to leave you with a clip from my conversation next week that will be released with Ashwin Ramani, the lead pastor of West Park Church in London, Ontario.
Her husband had just died, and she said, I don't know if I have any more purpose in life, right? My husband passed away, but yet something is telling me that there's something still left for me to contribute. You're starting this new Canadian Friendship Center. Is there any way I can serve? Right? She said, and I said, by all means, you will be loved here. A lot of them, these families have left their grandma and grandpas, and they've come. And so you will be their Canadian grandma. if you were to come, they would love you. And I just saw this person sitting in our cafe and just loved by all these kids, and the influence and the impact that she has had, right? She became one of our strongest volunteers who served and had such a powerful impact, on many non-Christian families. And she was like, and then even when we used to talk about it, and she always remembered that conversation, how hesitant she was at first, and then she took that step of faith outside of her comfort zone, saw God at work.